be impressed because it kicks off a weekend celebration of rock and religion. Dan Graham made this video work 30 years ago, so it's a big celebration, and he's traveling the world practically, celebrating it everywhere. He'll be here tomorrow talking at 1 o'clock and then introducing the video, and then have a gala dinner tomorrow evening. So I was just saying to Tom that this is kind of a stretch for a Shaker Museum to be doing. It's not the tour guides in costume showing you how the Shakers live. It's something pretty different, but I hope you'll enjoy it. And we're really delighted to have Tom Carroll here introducing the film. He's pinch hitting at the last minute. A fellow named Langdon Winter had hoped to introduce the film and then had a conflict at the last minute. So doubly thankful, both for being here and for stepping in at the last minute. Tom is a native of Princeton, New Jersey. He's a cultural historian. And I was reading, and it's kind of all over the map. It's amazing stuff. All kinds of, from Darwin to chemistry to all kinds of stuff. He graduated from Caltech and the University of Pennsylvania, was an executive director of the Hudson Mohawk Industrial Gateway from 1997 to 2013, and the executive director of Riverspar, New York's first heritage area from 2002 to 13, and is now a senior scholar. He was also, before that, associate professor of history in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at RPI, and he has held adjunct appointments both there and in the School of Architecture. And we have worked with the School of Architecture. We did a project with them 3 or 4 years ago called Material Manifestations, where the architecture students came and each student spent the entire semester with one object from our collection. It was quite interesting, and we published a book with them on that. Besides having published on the history of this region, he has published on topics ranging from Charles Darwin to the history of solid propellant rocketry. I don't really see the connection, but that's amazing. To the history of American chemistry. He's the co-author of the lead article in the centennial issue of Science magazine, the nation's leading magazine of scientific research, and he's the sole author of the lead article in the centennial issue of the American Scientist. Fantastic. So we're delighted to have him, and the format's going to be a little bit of an introduction. The video is 55 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion or questions at the end. The light gets a little gloomy in here, but I think we'll just bear with it, and if it gets too dark, we'll turn the lights on. So, Tom Carroll, thank you so much, and we're glad you're here.
Thank you, David. The connection is both of those were paying jobs, and I needed the money. Well, thank you, everybody. Tiny audience, but very cozy. Happy to be here. Langdon and I are colleagues in the Department of Science and Technology Studies for a long time, so that's where the connection was, and he apologizes that he couldn't come at the last minute. Wyatt's asked me to give you about 10-15 minutes of warm-up for this and try to set up this film for you. I should start by saying it's a knotty issue to do that. And I don't mean that in the traditional way, using the metaphor of those things that the Boy Scouts would tie a piece of rope and the connection to that, but another kind of knotty too, and that is to start out by saying, I am not Langdon Winter. If you know anything about him, you'll know some of the reasons why he would be a particularly appropriate person for this. But unlike Langdon Winter, I did not write any music reviews for Rolling Stone. Langdon, of course, is world famous for being their key music reviewer back in the old days of John Winter at the beginning. In fact, I haven't written a music review for anybody ever for anything. Not really my thing. I have a passing familiarity with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but I'm not an expert in any of them. Unlike Langdon, I was not a consultant for the film Koyaanisqatsi, which is a Native American term for nature out of order, which is also reasonably similar in theme to what we're going to see today. And unlike Langdon, I was not at Berkeley during the 1960s. I was, however, in Pasadena at Caltech, just a few hundred miles south, and it wasn't exactly the same climate as Berkeley, but it did have some overlap. So I do know something about that. And like Langdon, I do specialize in what we call science and technology studies. That catchphrase was coined by us at RPI, is now used around the world for the study of the relations between science, technology, and larger society, larger culture. And Langdon and I have both, for many, many, many years, long considered issues related to how people behave in times of great cultural transformations that involve technological change. And that's a big part of what this film is all about. If you don't get the film, I think I can help you figure it out once we do that. On the second level of it being a naughty issue, this film is almost certainly not something that Mother Ann Lee would have recommended that you watch. If you are expecting that, you might want to go back out the door now. It is also not a G-rated film or even rated PG. For example, rather prominently, it includes punk rocker Patti Smith, blurting out a whole lot of what at least some of you, I suspect, will consider questionably coherent expletive-laden assertions. If you feel that way as you watch the movie, don't feel too bad about it. Langdon and I both had coffee together on Monday and agreed that that's probably correct, that she was semi-coherent, and Lester Bangs, the famous music reviewer, agrees with that too. But she's not totally incoherent. There's message in this movie, and it does tell you some things. It's a very thought-provoking film. It was produced about 3 decades ago, as David said, for the Moderna Museum in Stockholm. Dan Graham considers himself a conceptual artist, and we can talk some about that after the film's been shown, about why that's an important term for what he does. What he does in this film is do parallels between seemingly very different things, like Mother Ann Lee and Patti Smith. The first obvious parallel that the film notes between the Shakers and rock music is, of course, the shaking of the Shakers and the shake, rattle, and roll of rock music. And it goes on from there and draws a lot of other parallels between the Shakers and rock music, and some similar movements, utopian moments and themes in history as well. You might want to keep track as you watch the 55 minutes of the film of all the different points that he tries to make of that sort. If you can follow it along, it's a little difficult to do that. By noting those comparisons, what the film suggests is that there are some consistent features in a great many instances where people were being transcendental, where they were trying to reach for something beyond the here and now, one way or another. And that tends to happen particularly prominently in times of great cultural upheaval. It talks about Mother Ann Lee in Manchester, England, in the British Industrial Revolution, and the Rock and Roll Revolution being at a similar time of cultural change. You want to notice the ambiguity in the title, Rock My Religion. If you'll pardon the pun, first interpretation of that is that this movie shakes religion to its roots, as does rock and roll. And a very ingenious history teacher in the Hudson Valley back in 1964 wrote a very fine article about the Wizard of Oz being a populist allegory of the rural agrarian way of life on the farm in Kansas being totally upset by this new urban industrial thing, monopolies coming, the railroad monopolies coming over like a tornado over the horizon and screwing up your little way of life and moving you to the city where all of that stuff about being prudent and frugal and staying close to the earth was swept aside and replaced with those people being country bumpkins and farmers and hayseeds, and the real smart people were the wizards who got rich quick instead of being prudent and so on and so forth. A complete upsetting of values. The big one that people always do in our field, of course, is the big scientific revolution of the replacement of the geocentric view of the world, the Earth at the center and everything going around it, to the heliocentric view of the world, for which Galileo, of course, was brought before the Inquisition, where we went around the sun instead. And Thomas Kuhn, the famous historian of science, wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962, introducing all of us to the word paradigm and the idea of thinking outside the box, which was the same notion of this flip-flop in the way you think about the world and what your belief system is. They always talk about periods when there is a millennium or an Armageddon or an eve of destruction or the collapse of everybody's used to, and its replacement is something else, and that's where technology gets involved. It often involves people experiencing that and dissenting, and you get dissenters like the Puritans and the Shakers dropping out from where they were and saying, this isn't right, we need an alternative to that. Mother Ann Lee rejecting middle life and sexuality, which gets played upon a lot in the film. They talk about Rebel Without a Cause, the movie, and the rejection of middle-class Levittown life. Betty Friedan doing the same thing with the feminine mystique, etc. And the seeking, once you become a dissenter and you decided that you don't accept the status quo, of adopting some kind of alternatives and seeking an alternative, a utopia, a burned-over district, an Oneida, a Shaker community. In the 60s, people were trying to get back to the garden after being in the space age and then rejecting that and watching the Waltons instead of the Jetsons on television. Seeking alternative lifestyles in the age of Aquarius and hippie communes, and starting to believe that the world maybe is much different than we thought it was, and doing things like watching Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, who obviously played with your mind of that sort between 1959 and 64, those original series. Often people in that frame of mind, in those kinds of contexts, find themselves seeking transcendence. They want to get past or beyond or above the mess that we're in to something, to some purer, higher state. There's often use of terms like purity, etc. And it often involves rituals that include music, rhythm, movement, and sensuality and sexuality. And this movie certainly stresses those four features of this kind of a thing. So, without further ado, if you aren't going to walk out the door because you know this is not a PG movie, or the assumption is that the filmmaker knew what was happening here himself, and that's a rather rash assumption. I think that an awful lot of people who've studied this phenomenon think that when people are living through it themselves, they don't really know what's going on very clearly themselves, and they're trying to sort it out. A lot of people argue that we are in the middle of one of these rather dramatic cultural transformations. We're going from an urban, industrial, nation-based social economic system to a global economy. The interdependencies among human beings and their ability to communicate with each other, etc., have been really radically transformed in our lifetime.